Now, a lot of times on this show, we recommend things that we think are worth your time, like an article, maybe from another news outlet, or maybe a documentary we think is worth watching. We also love to, when you share kind of those things with us as well. Like we got an email recently from a viewer that goes by C, and it says, "Hey Dan, I came across this article recently in the Statesman Journal, and I thought it was an interesting read. Always knew that Oregon was and continues to be a racist state, no matter where one lived. Glad to see some real data on how much bigotry lies under the surface." Now, here is the data that C is talking about. You can see the headline there. 4 in 10 Oregonians agree with core white nationalist arguments, survey reveals. The Statesman Journal, they published this story on a new survey that found 40% of Oregonians agree with statements like America must, quote, protect and preserve its white European heritage. That's up 9 percentage points from when the same survey was done in 2018. It also found that a number of Oregonians agree with America protecting its multicultural heritage has dropped in the last 3 years. This survey was commissioned by the Western States Center. They're a nonprofit group that they say they promote inclusivity and democracy. And I talked to the deputy director there about the results of this survey and what she thinks we should take from it.
Can you give me some examples of a white nationalist argument that this 3 and some change percent, or 4 out of 10 Oregonians agreed with?
Certainly. So I'll start by just saying a little bit more about white nationalism and how we characterize it at Western State Center. We really see white nationalism as a bigoted social movement that seeks to create a white-only ethno-state in the United States. Its supporters seek to build political power and often look to implement extreme racist, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim policy. White nationalists and the closely aligned broader alt-right coalition often have deeply anti-government ideologies, as well as anti-Semitic ideology, making them a threat to communities and our democratic institutions. And 2 of the statements that we saw that 4 in 10 agreement level from Oregonians that align with white nationalist discourse was protect and preserve its white European heritage, and that white people in America face discrimination and unfair treatment on the basis of race. Those are tropes and harmful talking points from the white nationalist movement that we saw some level of agreement among close to 40% of Oregonians.
What is your takeaway? What should the average Oregonian take away from this type of study?
Sure. I think the data shows us the scale of work that needs to be done, right, to protect inclusive democracy and make it more equitable. The vulnerability that many Americans have to white nationalists and bigoted messaging, as well as a fair amount of hope, right, that the majority of Oregonians clearly believe in racial justice and building a multiracial, inclusive democracy. So I think the survey has some warning signals, but is overall affirming about the shared values that the majority of Oregonians have around protecting democratic institutions and building equitable societies.
Now, we've talked a lot about Oregon's racist roots on this show. Sometimes I think people think we're like degrading the state or something like that. We're not. We're just looking at the history of this state, how it was founded, some of the things that are laying the roots of our community, including the black exclusion laws. The state's original constitution literally wrote in that it banned black people from living in this state. The rise of the KKK, also in Oregon in the early 20th century. You can check out a lot of our coverage on the KGW YouTube channel.